Imagine a world where the sky itself turns against you. The sun fades behind a veil of ash, and the air grows colder with every passing day. 70,000 years ago, long before cities or kingdoms, before stories were written on stone or parchment, the earth changed in a single violent heartbeat. A mountain in Sumatra roared to life, and the Toba Supervolcano erupted with a force so devastating it nearly erased our species from existence. For the tiny bands of humans scattered across Africa and Asia, survival was no longer about hunting or gathering. It was about finding warmth where there was none, about clinging to life as the world froze under a sky thick with ash. Some scientists believe that in those years, the human population may have dwindled to just a few thousand souls. Every person alive today may carry the legacy of those who survived that long night. This is not the polished history of empires and monuments. This is the raw memory of a species teetering on the edge of extinction. As you close your eyes, let the story of Toba unfold in whispers, like a fire burning slowly in the dark. And before we begin this journey into one of humanity's darkest trials, I would like to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what hour does this story find you? Share your answer below, and let us connect across time zones and across lives. And if you have not already, consider joining this circle of night listeners. Because in this place, history is not just told, it is remembered softly in the quiet before sleep. Before the roar of mountains, before the ash that blotted out the sun, there was a quieter earth. 75,000 years ago, our ancestors lived in a world balanced between danger and wonder. It was a place both recognizable and alien, a stage set for survival rather than civilization. Africa remained the cradle of humanity, a continent alive with shifting grasslands, deserts, and deep green forests. Herds of antelope and gazelle crossed the plains in endless motion, their hooves drumming a rhythm older than history itself. Lions, leopards, and hyenas followed in silent pursuit, each predator etched into the memory of early humans as threats never to be underestimated. The air carried scents of rain and dust, of wild blossoms and fires smoldering in the night. This was the environment in which our species learned what it meant to endure. Our ancestors were not gathered in kingdoms, nor did they raise walls of stone or temples to the sky. Instead, they traveled in small bands, groups of 20, 30, sometimes fewer. Each group was a family bound not by choice, but by survival. They shared food, warmth, and stories whispered around flames. Their lives were fragile, yet within that fragility lay an extraordinary resilience. Fire was at the center of everything. To us, a flame is ordinary, a tool at our fingertips. To them, it was a miracle to be nurtured, carried, and preserved. Bundles of smoking grass and embers hidden in clay-lined pits kept the fire alive even during long journeys. Fire meant cooked meat, softer roots, and warmth against nights that grew unexpectedly cold. It meant safety, a circle of light against the darkness that prowled just beyond. It meant community, where shadows on stone walls danced as voices told of hunts, storms, and the mysteries of the stars. The world itself was shifting beneath their feet. The earth of 75,000 years ago was caught in the rhythm of ice ages. Vast sheets of frozen land pushed south from Europe and Asia, covering valleys and mountains in cold silence. Even in Africa, the heartbeat of the climate was unpredictable. Sometimes the rains came heavy and generous, turning the land green with life. Other times, the sky closed itself, leaving drought and dust, and families walked for days to find water. For humans then, adaptation was not a choice. It was the essence of existence. They knew the land intimately. There were no maps, no written records, only memories carried in stories and footsteps. A valley might be remembered by the shape of a distant tree. A river bend might be recalled by the taste of its water. Knowledge passed from elder to child was not abstract but immediate, a matter of life and death. Do not drink from this pool, for it poisons. Do not walk this ridge at dusk, for the lions hunt there. Such wisdom was the compass of survival. These humans were like us, in body and mind, though their lives were stripped to the bone. They used tools shaped from stone, flakes sharpened to slice hides, points fastened to wooden shafts for the hunt. They dressed in furs, their skins rubbed with earth and ash against insects and cold. They sang in languages that no one alive today can understand, yet each note must have carried the same longing for safety, the same hope for tomorrow. At night, the world pressed closer. Imagine a family crouched within a shallow cave, the fire sputtering low. Outside, the wind howled through grasses taller than a man. Somewhere far off, the deep-throated roar of a lion broke the stillness. In such moments, fear was not just an emotion, it was a guardian. It sharpened the senses, bound people together, and kept them alive. But alongside fear, there was wonder. The same firelight that flickered against stone also lit the stars above. Humans looked upward then, as we do now, at constellations scattered across the dark canvas of night. They may not have named them as we do, but surely they asked the same questions. Where do we come from? Who watches from above? Why does the sky change? Curiosity was already seated in the human mind, a flame that no storm could extinguish. In Asia, small groups had already begun their long journey from Africa, hugging coastlines and rivers, following fish and shellfish, tracing the path of survival. These pioneers carried with them the same fragile fire, the same laughter and grief, as they stepped onto lands no human had ever seen. In Arabia, in India, and beyond, footprints marked the edges of a migration that would, millennia later, encircle the globe. But all of it, every song, every footprint, every story, was balanced on the thin edge of chance. For beneath the forests and hills of Sumatra, the earth was stirring. Deep below, magma was rising, building in chambers vast enough to reshape continents. Pressure accumulated over thousands of years, unseen and unheard by the humans who walked the surface. To them, the land seemed stable, a mountain draped in green, a horizon as ordinary as the sky itself. They could not know that inside that mountain slept a force that could darken the planet. The scale of this threat was unimaginable. For us, with satellites and sensors, volcanoes are monitored and measured. For them, the Earth was alive in ways they did not understand, its tremors and fires seen as mysteries or signs from spirits. The volcano was no more dangerous to them, in their eyes, than a sudden storm or a lurking predator. Yet, this storm would not be confined to a single valley. This predator would not hunt one family. What was gathering in Toba would reach across oceans, altering the climate of the entire planet. In hindsight, it is tempting to think of this as destiny, but for those small, scattered bands of humans, it was simply life as it had always been, uncertain, fragile, lit by firelight, and shadowed by fear. The stage was set. Humanity thrived in its own modest way, clinging to existence, not knowing that soon the world would shake, the skies would darken, and survival itself would be tested in ways no one could imagine. This was the calm before the storm, the fragile chapter before the page was burned. In the quiet before disaster, humanity still walked the earth unaware, not yet realizing that the fate of the species would be decided not by spear or hunger, but by the restless heart of the planet itself. Far across the seas, from the wandering bands of humans, in the heart of what we now call Sumatra, a giant lay hidden. Today, when we look at Lake Toba, we see a tranquil expanse of water shimmering beneath the tropical sun. It is the largest volcanic lake on Earth, stretching 100 kilometers from end to end, cradled by steep cliffs and lush forests. Tourists sail across its calm surface, unaware that this lake is not merely a lake at all. It is a scar, a wound carved by one of the greatest disasters in the history of the planet. But 75,000 years ago, before the lake was born, there stood a mountain. Not a single peak like Mount Fuji or Kilimanjaro, but a massive volcanic complex, its flanks covered in forests, its slopes fed by rivers teeming with life. To those who lived within sight of it, it must have seemed like part of the landscape, as permanent as the sky itself. Birds nested in its trees, rain soaked its soil. Smoke may have curled occasionally from its summit, but for countless generations it slumbered in silence. Beneath that silence, however, the earth was restless. Deep chambers filled with magma, molten rock, rising slowly from the mantle, pooling beneath the crust. Imagine reservoirs the size of mountains themselves, glowing red, pressing upward against layers of stone. The pressure grew year after year, century after century, in a cycle so vast that no human eye could see it. For them, time was measured in seasons and lifespans. For the Earth, time was measured in eons. The Toba Supervolcano belonged to a rare class of geological titans. We call them supervolcanoes because their eruptions are not simply destructive on a local scale, but catastrophic on a planetary scale. To grasp their power, consider Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980 with a force that flattened forests for miles, or Krakatoa in 1883, whose explosion echoed around the world and whose tsunamis killed tens of thousands. Now imagine an eruption thousands of times greater. That is the scale of Toba. If you were standing there then, you would not have known. The forests would have been alive with birdsong, the rivers clear and full of fish. Perhaps smoke drifted lazily from vents, a reminder of fire below, but nothing that warned of annihilation. To the people who lived within reach of its shadow, the mountain was simply another horizon, its presence so constant that it faded into the background of daily struggle. And yet, within that mountain, cracks were forming. Pressure built until stone itself strained and groaned. When the end came, it did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived as a roar that tore the sky apart. The eruption of Toba was unlike anything humans had ever experienced, unlike anything in our recorded memory. In a matter of hours, the mountain disintegrated. Its summit collapsed inward, creating the vast caldera that now holds Lake Toba. Ash billowed upward, climbing into the stratosphere, higher than any storm cloud. Pyroclastic flows, rivers of fire and ash moving faster than any animal could flee, raced outward, annihilating forests, lakes, and valleys in an instant. Scientists estimate that the eruption expelled nearly 3,000 cubic kilometers of material. To picture this is almost impossible. Imagine every skyscraper in every city on Earth reduced to dust and then multiplied 1,000 times. Imagine the sky itself turned solid with ash, blotting out the sun. The energy released has been compared to millions of nuclear bombs detonating at once. The land around Toba was erased. Nothing survived within hundreds of miles. Forests were leveled, rivers boiled, and entire ecosystems turned to wasteland. The roar of the eruption must have carried across continents, the shockwaves circling the globe. And above it all, the plume of ash kept rising, spreading, until it wrapped around the earth. This was the true danger of Toba, not just the destruction at its heart, but the shadow it cast across the entire planet. Volcanic ash is more than dust. It is glass, sharp and fine, drifting across winds, settling in lungs, poisoning water, and blanketing fields. Sulfur dioxide rose with the ash, mixing in the atmosphere, creating veils that blocked sunlight. For months, for years, the earth grew darker and colder. We call this effect a volcanic winter. Crops fail, plants wither, animals die. For humans living 75,000 years ago, there were no granaries to rely on, no reserves to feed the hungry. Food was found fresh or not at all. A world plunged into winter meant famine, meant desperation. From this one mountain, the fate of humanity trembled. For some scientists, this was the moment of the bottleneck, the narrowing of our species to perhaps only a few thousand survivors. In genetic code today, in the DNA that shapes your eyes, your skin, your voice, there may linger the faint echo of that crisis. And all of it began here, with a mountain that slept too long and then awoke with fury. Lake Toba remains today, still and silent, its blue waters reflecting the sky. But beneath it, magma still stirs. The giant is not dead. It only sleeps. The silence ended in an instant. What had slumbered for centuries erupted with a violence that defies imagination. The Toba Supervolcano did not simply break open. It tore the sky apart. For those who might have been within sight of the mountain, the world changed in the space of a heartbeat. The first sign was a thunder that shook the ground itself. Not the rumble of a distant storm, but a roar so deep it came through bone and marrow. Animals scattered in panic, birds lifted in dark swarms, and the earth split with a sound like the snapping of 1,000 forests. In that moment, the air itself seemed to ignite. The eruption began with explosions that hurled molten rock miles into the sky. The summit of the mountain shattered, releasing pressure that had been building for millennia. Ash, smoke, and fire rose upward in a column that pierced the stratosphere, rising higher than Everest, higher than any mountain ever climbed. To imagine it is to imagine the sky turned into a pillar of night. Pyroclastic flows surged outward at terrifying speed, rivers of fire and ash moving faster than a cheetah could run. They hugged the ground, searing forests to nothing, boiling lakes in seconds, and burying valleys beneath blankets of incandescent stone. No living thing could outrun them. Trees became torches, animals collapsed where they stood, and landscapes that had endured for ages vanished in hours. The heat alone was beyond comprehension. Within the radius of destruction, the air was hotter than the core of a furnace. Inhalation was impossible. The first breath would scorch the lungs. Ash filled every corner, entering eyes, mouths, and rivers. Those few humans who might have lived within 1,000 miles would have seen their world erased in fire. The explosion of Toba expelled an unimaginable volume of material, close to 3,000 cubic kilometers of ash and rock. It was enough to bury entire nations beneath a suffocating layer, enough to build new mountains from the ruins of the old. Dust and ash fell in waves, coating the earth in gray, turning day into night, and night into a deeper abyss. Imagine standing in Africa, thousands of miles away. Even there, the sun dimmed, a haze spread across the horizon, painting sunsets in blood red and violet. The air grew heavy with fine particles, invisible but deadly, carried by winds that circled the globe. For weeks, for months, the sky remained veiled. The sound itself may have traveled around the world. Krakatoa in 1883 was heard thousands of miles away. Toba was 100 times greater. Perhaps, in distant valleys where humans huddled by fires, the faint echo reached them, a low, rolling thunder that never ended. And then came the darkness. Ash clouds spread across continents, blotting out the sun. Temperatures fell rapidly, rain mixed with ash, turning to acid that stripped leaves from trees and poisoned streams. Crops, where they grew, withered, grazing animals starved. Hunters found less and less to kill. This was not a storm that passed. This was not a season of hunger. This was the beginning of years of famine, of cold, of silence where once there had been life. Scientists call it a volcanic winter. But for the people of 75,000 years ago, there were no words. There was only the struggle to endure. In the span of a few days, the world shifted. Forests vanished, rivers turned to mud, skies turned to stone. The memory of this event is not preserved in writing, but perhaps it lived on in whispers, in myths of fire and shadow told around dwindling flames. Perhaps those who survived carried with them a fear that shaped the stories of gods and punishments, of worlds destroyed and worlds reborn. The eruption of Toba was more than a geological event. It was a test of the human spirit, a crucible that nearly consumed us all. For in that single eruption, the population of our species may have collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. From tens of thousands, perhaps only a few thousand remained, scattered and desperate. And yet, from that nightmarish moment, from the ash and the darkened skies, humanity endured. The eruption had torn the world apart, but it had not destroyed the will to live. Those who survived carried forward not just their bodies, but the memory of fire and shadow, etched into the very fabric of our DNA. The earth had roared, the sky had fallen, and humanity, against all odds, had taken its first steps through the firestorm. When the mountain was finished tearing itself apart, when its roar finally quieted, what lingered was not silence but shadow. The eruption of Toba did not end in a single day, nor in a single month. Its true power lay not only in the violence of its fire, but in the long night that followed. Ash and dust spread outward like a shroud. Winds carried fine particles into the highest reaches of the atmosphere, where they drifted and circled the globe. They were so light that they did not fall quickly. Instead, they remained suspended layer upon layer, forming a veil that dimmed the sun. The earth, once bright with light and warmth, grew cold beneath a canopy of gray. For those alive then, the change must have been terrifyingly swift. Days grew shorter not by the turning of seasons, but by a darkness that crept in even at midday. The sky turned copper, then black, stars vanished. The sun became no more than a pale disk, faint and weak, unable to pierce the haze. Children born into this world may never have seen a true sunrise. Temperatures plummeted. Without sunlight, warmth bled from the land. Rivers crusted with ice in places where water had always run free. Snow fell farther south than it had in centuries. Forests withered, their leaves coated with ash, their roots poisoned by rain that had turned acidic. What animals remained grew thin, their herds dwindling as grasslands shrank into wastelands. For humans, life became a daily negotiation with despair. Fire remained their only defense, but even fire could not feed empty bellies. Hunters returned with nothing, their tracks crossing empty valleys where once herds had thrived. Gatherers found roots brittle and bitter, berries shriveled, and streams laced with grit. Hunger gnawed without pause, a steady ache that hollowed the body and clouded the mind. Imagine a small band huddled in a cave. Their fire sputters low, fed by the last scraps of wood scavenged from a dead forest. Outside, ash drifts down like snow, piling silently, choking every breath. Inside, the air is close, filled with coughs as lungs strain against the dust. A child cries, but weakly, the sound fading into the crackle of embers. The elders exchange looks, they do not speak aloud. How many more nights can we endure? The volcanic winter stretched not for weeks, but for years. Some scientists believe the world cooled by several degrees, enough to deepen the grip of the Ice Age. For early humans with no reserves, no agriculture, no storage, even a single failed season meant catastrophe. To endure multiple failed years was nearly impossible. And so the population dwindled. Perhaps entire groups vanished without trace, their fires extinguished, their stories silenced. Valleys that once echoed with voices fell quiet. Paths once trodden by bare feet grew over with ash. Humanity shrank until, by some estimates, fewer than 10,000 remained alive. Our species, spread across continents, had become smaller than many animal herds. The struggle was not only against hunger, but against the mind. Darkness has a weight. To live under a sky that never brightens, to wake each day to a twilight world, must have bred despair deeper than famine itself. Without light, hope falters. Without warmth, community fractures. It is possible that rituals were born in this time, chants, carvings, offerings to forces unseen, efforts to explain and endure the unendurable. Yet even in this night, sparks endured. Somewhere on some plain in Africa, a family kept its fire alive. Somewhere in India, a band followed a river and found fish still moving in its depths. Somewhere in a sheltered cave, children survived long enough to grow into adults. Against the weight of extinction, survival clung stubbornly, desperately. The volcanic winter was the shadow of Toba, a darkness more profound than any single explosion. It was a test stretched across generations, one that few passed, but those who did became the thread from which all of us descend. And as the years passed, as ash slowly settled and skies thinned, the earth began to breathe again. Sunlight pierced the veil, forests stirred, rivers cleared, but the memory of darkness did not fade. It lived in the bodies of those who survived, in their hunger and their scars, and in the DNA that whispers still within us all. The giant had roared, the world had darkened, and humanity had almost vanished. Yet even in the longest night, the flame of survival had not gone out. In the long shadow of Toba's eruption, survival was no longer a matter of thriving. It was reduced to its barest essence, to live one more day, to keep one more child breathing through the night. The world had changed. Where once food could be found with patience and skill, now the land itself seemed unwilling to give. Hunting, which had always been dangerous, became almost impossible. Herds of animals had scattered or died. Grasslands that once fed them had withered beneath layers of ash. Hunters who left camp returned empty-handed, their faces gaunt, their voices hollow with failure. A spear could not pierce hunger itself. Gathering roots, berries, and seeds became equally uncertain. Plants grew thin in the poisoned soil, their leaves shriveled, their fruits bitter or gone altogether. What little remained often carried ash, turning meals into gritty reminders of the disaster. Water was no relief. Streams were clogged with dust, their clarity replaced by gray clouds that choked and sickened those who drank. For the small human bands scattered across Africa and Asia, choices narrowed into desperation. Fire could keep them warm, but it could not fill their stomachs. And so survival demanded decisions that tested the very core of humanity. There are whispers in the fossil record, and in the stories of anthropologists, that some groups may have turned to what they once would have feared or despised. The dead could not be left to waste when the living starved. In some places, perhaps, the line between sustenance and taboo blurred until it vanished entirely. For those who survived, it was not morality that guided them, but the relentless need to live. More often, survival came through relentless movement. Families abandoned the caves and valleys they had known for generations, setting out across barren plains in search of anything that could sustain them. Imagine parents carrying children too weak to walk, the elderly falling behind, the group pressing forward with no certainty that food or safety lay ahead. Each step was both a gamble and a surrender. To stay meant death, to walk meant the chance of life. Some found refuge in coastal regions where the sea still offered fish and shellfish. These shores became lifelines, the edge of the world transformed into narrow corridors of survival. Others clung to rivers, following their courses in hopes of finding cleaner water, game, or plants, sheltered from the worst of the ash. In these migrations, humanity reshaped itself, pushing into new lands, forming bonds across distance, learning to endure together or perish apart. But even these strategies had limits. The volcanic winter lasted years, and no band could outrun the cold forever. Fires grew harder to maintain as wood became scarce. Ash clogged the lungs, weakening the body. Illness spread in close quarters, and without medicine, a single cough could claim many lives. Hunger sharpened not only the body but the mind, breeding conflict within groups. Resources meant survival, and survival meant tension. Families fractured, bands split. Violence, once reserved for the hunt, turned inward. Still, within this crucible, something remarkable stirred. Humans had always been social creatures, but now cooperation became more vital than ever. To share food, to guard fire, to comfort the weak, to teach children, these acts became sacred, not for ritual, but for necessity. Without them, no one survived. It is possible that language itself deepened in this time. Where words had once been enough to shout warnings or share directions, now they became tools of comfort and planning. To speak hope aloud was to strengthen the spirit. To whisper a plan was to guide the group forward. The dark years of famine may have carved sharper edges into human communication, forcing us to become more than survivors, forcing us to become storytellers, planners, and keepers of memory. Imagine a night in those years. A band gathers in a cave, their fires small but alive. They have eaten little, their stomachs tight with hunger. Yet one elder begins to speak, not of hunger, but of memory, of rivers that once flowed full, of hunts that once fed them all, of skies that were once blue. Children lean against their mothers, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet they listen. In that moment, the story itself becomes sustenance, carrying the idea of survival into the uncertain dawn. But the cost was immense. The price of survival was not measured only in bodies lost, but in what was endured. To outlast Toba's shadow meant to live with scars, scars written in the body, in hunger-wasted limbs, in shortened lives, in grief carried like stone. It also meant scars written in the mind, memories of endless twilight, of journeys that led nowhere, of faces that vanished into ash and silence. The world after Toba was colder, darker, and emptier. Humanity was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Yet in that reduction lay resilience. Those who survived proved that endurance was possible even against odds that seemed absolute. They paid the price, and through their payment, we exist. Every one of us carries their legacy. The shape of our DNA tells of a narrowing, a bottleneck where humanity nearly vanished, and yet, through hunger, despair, and loss, a few thousand men, women, and children carried the species forward. They are the reason there is a we at all. The price of survival was high beyond measure, but it was paid in full. And from that payment, the story of humanity continued. Long after the fires of Toba had dimmed and the ash had begun to settle, its shadow lived on in the bodies of those who remained. Catastrophes leave scars not only on landscapes, but on the very fabric of life. For humanity, the scar of Toba was written in our DNA. Today, when scientists study the genetic code of people across the globe, whether in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, they find something astonishing. For all our diversity of faces, languages, and cultures, our genetic variation is remarkably small. Compared to chimpanzees, compared to gorillas, compared even to many species of birds, we are uniform, cousins much closer than we appear. The reason, many believe, lies in a moment 70,000 years ago when humanity nearly vanished. This is the theory of the genetic bottleneck. A bottleneck occurs when a species shrinks to a tiny fraction of its former size, when only a few individuals survive to pass on their genes. From that point forward, the descendants carry the imprint of that narrow survival, a reduction in genetic diversity that lingers for millennia. For humans, the bottleneck may have been brutal. Some scientists suggest that our population may have been reduced to as few as 3,000, perhaps even fewer. Imagine it, the entire human race smaller than the crowd at a modern stadium, scattered across a fractured world. Each life, then, was not just personal, not just family. Each life was the continuation of our species. The evidence lies hidden in the double helix. Our genes tell the story of shared ancestry, of lines that converge in the not-so-distant past. While we look different, speak differently, live in different environments, the DNA of a person in Africa and a person in Asia is strikingly similar. This homogeneity suggests that we all descend from a surprisingly small pool of survivors. And so, the silence of Toba still whispers in us. Every heartbeat, every breath carries within it the triumph of those who endured. Yet their endurance came at a price. Genetic diversity, once wider, was reduced. Traits that might have flourished were lost. Entire branches of possibility withered before they could bloom. Picture a world where humanity had been more varied, with thousands of lineages evolving in parallel. That world may have vanished with Toba, reduced to a single fragile thread of survival. It is as if the tree of humanity was pruned nearly to the stump, and from that stump grew again, slender but resilient. The bottleneck explains more than similarity, it explains vulnerability. With fewer genetic variations, diseases may have found us easier prey. Adaptations that could have helped in new environments may have been lost forever. Humanity did not emerge stronger from Toba, but narrower, bound more tightly to one another by shared fragility. And yet, within that fragility there was strength. A smaller population meant closer bonds, more unified cultures, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection. Those who survived did so not as isolated individuals, but as groups who relied utterly on each other. Cooperation, already vital, became the difference between life and death. This, too, is written in our DNA, in the evolution of empathy, of communication, of community. The bottleneck may also have shaped the way we think. Scarcity sharpens the mind, teaches planning, forces creativity. To endure years of volcanic winter required more than muscle. It required foresight, memory, and imagination. Those who lacked these traits perished. Those who possessed them became our ancestors. In this way, the disaster did not just winnow our numbers, it refined the qualities that would one day allow us to build civilizations. Still, the numbers are haunting. Imagine all of humanity today, billions of us, spread across continents, speaking thousands of languages, inventing machines that reach into space. Then trace us back, generation by generation, until we are reduced to a few thousand souls clinging to survival. Every person you have ever known, every story ever told, descends from that fragile remnant. It is humbling, it is terrifying, and it is miraculous. The genetic bottleneck reminds us that we are not invincible, that our presence on Earth has always been precarious, but it also reminds us that survival against odds is woven into our being. The fire that kept our ancestors alive in caves, the cooperation that bound families together in famine, the imagination that saw a way forward in endless dark. These are not relics, they live in us still. So when we look at each other, at the endless variety of faces and voices, we should remember how close we came to silence. We are different, but we are bound by the same narrow passage of survival. We are, all of us, children of the bottleneck, the descendants of those who endured the long night after Toba. And as the earth began slowly to heal, as skies cleared and rivers ran free again, those survivors carried forward not only their scars but their will. Humanity had been broken nearly to extinction, yet from that brokenness grew a new beginning. When the world turned dark, survival was not only a struggle of bodies, it was also a struggle of minds. To endure famine, cold, and loss, humans needed more than fire and food. They needed meaning. Fear is ancient. It sharpens the senses, tightens the muscles, and pushes the body to act. But when fear stretches not for hours, but for years, when every sunrise is dim and every night endless, it becomes heavier than hunger itself. In those years after Toba, humanity was forced to confront a terror it could not fight with spears. The earth itself seemed angry. The sky itself seemed broken. How could small bands of people make sense of such vast destruction? Perhaps it was in this crucible that belief was born. Before Toba, humans already wondered at the stars and the storms, but now the questions grew sharper. Why had the sun vanished? Why did the rains burn the skin? Why had the animals gone silent? With no answers, humans created them. Spirits, gods, and forces unseen became explanations for the inexplicable. Around the fire, elders may have spoken of a great beast beneath the earth, stirring and roaring, sending smoke into the sky. Others may have whispered of a punishment, of ancestors displeased, of a balance broken. Children, wide-eyed and thin with hunger, listened and believed, because belief gave shape to chaos. Rituals may have begun in these times. A carved figure left by the fire, a chant repeated before a hunt, a handprint pressed onto the wall of a cave. These acts were not superstition to them, they were survival of the spirit. When food was scarce and death common, ritual gave comfort. It told people that they were not powerless, that by gesture or song they could influence forces larger than themselves. Imagine a night deep in the volcanic winter, a group huddles close, the fire burning weakly. Outside, ash drifts silently, muffling every sound. Inside, voices rise together, humming a low, steady song. The rhythm is simple, but it binds them. For a moment, they are not hungry, not alone. They are connected to one another, to the ancestors, to the mysterious powers of the sky. Belief did not fill their bellies, but it gave them strength to face the next morning. And strength of spirit was as important as strength of body. Bands that shared rituals and stories held together. Bands without them fractured and vanished. Over generations, these practices became traditions, carried forward even after the skies cleared. The memory of darkness remained, and with it the habits of prayer, song, and offering. These were the seeds of religion, planted in ash, watered by fear, and kept alive by hope. The genetic bottleneck may explain why our DNA is narrow, but belief explains why our spirit endured. Without it, the endless night may have broken us. With it, we found reasons to keep walking, to keep searching, to keep the fire alive. It is humbling to think that the faiths of today, whether in gods, spirits, or the mysteries of the universe, may trace their roots back to this long night after Toba. The need to make sense of suffering, the urge to connect with something beyond ourselves, the rituals that soothe fear and bind communities. All of these may have been born when the world grew cold and humanity nearly vanished. Fear carved the first prayers, hunger carved the first offerings, darkness carved the first stories of gods. And in those stories, humanity found not only survival, but identity. We became a species not only of flesh and bone, but of imagination and belief. The world was still harsh, but within us grew something that no winter could freeze: the power to create meaning in the face of despair. As the years slowly passed after the Toba eruption, the world remained scarred. Ash still blanketed wide swaths of land, and the memory of darkness lingered in every story, in every scarred body that had survived the famine. Yet, within that fragile remnant of humanity, something stirred. Survival was no longer just about enduring another season. It was about moving, searching, finding new horizons where life might be possible. Africa had always been the cradle of our kind. It was where Homo sapiens had first risen, where countless generations had hunted, gathered, and sung beneath open skies. But the volcanic winter had altered the rhythm of the land. Rains were fickle, rivers ran shallow, forests shrank into patches of green islands surrounded by dust. For some groups, staying meant slow starvation. The only choice was to leave. And so began one of the greatest journeys in the history of our species, the migration out of Africa. It was not a single march, not a vast exodus of thousands. It was smaller, quieter, almost invisible. A band here, another there. Families no larger than a few dozen, each carrying fire, tools, and the memory of ancestors. They followed coastlines where fish and shellfish still lingered. They traced the winding lines of rivers, drinking from their currents and hoping the water would lead to fertile lands. Step by step, generation by generation, humanity stretched itself beyond its birthplace. The first to leave may have crossed what is now the Red Sea when sea levels were lower, stepping onto the Arabian Peninsula. Imagine the courage of such a crossing, the land behind familiar but failing, the land ahead unknown, perhaps hostile. Yet the hunger in their stomachs pushed them forward. The promise of survival outweighed the comfort of home. From Arabia, some followed the coasts eastward, skirting deserts where life was too harsh, hugging the line where land met sea. Others pressed inland, finding pockets of green in a world still marked by ash. Each step was a test. Some groups vanished, swallowed by hunger, disease, or conflict. But others endured, leaving faint traces, stone tools, fragments of bone, that whisper their passage across time. In India, evidence suggests that humans were present soon after Toba's eruption, adapting to new landscapes, hunting unfamiliar animals, and gathering plants strange to their tongues. Along the coasts of Southeast Asia, small bands learned the rhythms of tides and the richness of reefs. The world was not generous, but it was vast. And within its vastness, there were always hidden pockets where life could take root. The journey was not a straight line. It was winding, halting, filled with setbacks and returns. Yet, over thousands of years, the migration continued, carrying humanity into lands never before touched by our feet. Into China, into Australia, into Europe, into the distant corners of the earth. All of it began with those small, desperate movements out of Africa, driven by hunger, by curiosity, and by the simple need to survive. These migrations reshaped us. Different groups encountered different challenges: deserts that seared the skin, mountains that froze the blood, forests thick with dangers unknown. To endure, they adapted. They crafted new tools, discovered new foods, and learned to clothe themselves against climates harsher than anything in their homeland. The journey out of Africa was not just a movement of bodies, but of minds. Every challenge demanded invention. Every obstacle demanded imagination. And as they moved, they carried with them the memory of Toba. Perhaps they told their children of the great fire, of the long darkness, of the hunger that had nearly ended them. Perhaps these stories became warnings, myths of wrathful gods, or tales of survival against impossible odds. Whatever form they took, they were carried forward, shaping the way humans understood the world they entered. The great journey was not only outward, it was also inward, reshaping what it meant to be human. Bands that had once lived in isolation began to encounter one another in new lands. Sometimes they clashed, competing for scarce resources. Sometimes they mingled, sharing knowledge, tools, and blood. It is likely that in these migrations, our ancestors met and mingled with other kinds of humans, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, leaving traces of those encounters in the DNA we carry today. To imagine this time is to imagine humanity stretched thin across continents, fragile yet relentless. Each small group a flame in the dark, flickering but not extinguished. Together, though they may never have known it, they carried the species beyond the edge of extinction. The journey out of Africa was not heroic in the way later histories would describe empires and kings. It was quiet, desperate, made of small steps and whispered prayers, but it was perhaps the most important journey we have ever taken. Without it, humanity might have remained trapped in the shadow of Toba, dwindling until silence claimed us. With it, we became a species of the world. Today, when we look across oceans, when we walk the streets of cities filled with people from every continent, we are witnessing the legacy of that migration. The blood in our veins, the languages on our tongues, the diversity of our faces, all of it can be traced back to the small bands that chose to walk away from home and into the unknown. In leaving Africa, they did not just escape famine, they began the story of humanity as we know it, a story of explorers, of survivors, of wanderers who turned the entire earth into their home. When Homo sapiens struggled through the long night after Toba, we were not alone. The world 70,000 years ago was not empty of humans. It was shared with cousins, different but familiar, each shaped by their own landscapes, each carrying their own stories of survival. In Europe and Western Asia lived the Neanderthals. Stockier, stronger, built for cold, they were masters of their harsh environments. Their bodies were thick with muscle, their faces heavy-browed, their hands skilled in crafting tools of stone and bone. They hunted mammoth and bison, tanned hides, and lit fires in deep caves where walls glowed with flickering light. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had endured the Ice Age with a resilience that seemed unshakable. Farther east, in the mountains and valleys of Asia, lived others, the Denisovans. We know them less well, their bones discovered only recently, fragments of teeth and finger bones hidden in caves. Yet, from these fragments, from the whispers of their DNA found in us, we know they were real, another branch of humanity, living and thriving in lands we had not yet fully entered. When Toba erupted, its ash did not respect boundaries. Winds carried darkness across continents. Crops withered not just in Africa, but in Asia. Herds dwindled not just for us, but for them. The Neanderthals faced colder winters, harsher hunts, dwindling prey. The Denisovans, too, must have felt the weight of famine pressing against their camps. The volcanic winter was a challenge for all of humanity in every form it took. For a time, it seemed as though none might endure. Yet each species adapted as best it could. The Neanderthals huddled in caves, making use of their strength and their skill with fire. They scavenged what they could, sharing meat and marrow, clinging together through endless winters. The Denisovans may have turned to highland refuges, to rivers still running, to caves where ash could not suffocate their fires. And then, into this fragile balance came us, Homo sapiens, emerging from Africa, thin and hungry, carrying with us both desperation and ingenuity. Our paths crossed with theirs, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in union. In caves across Europe and Asia, we left traces not only of tools and fire, but of mingling blood. Modern humans today carry fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, reminders that survival was not just about struggle, but also about connection. It is easy to imagine competition. Scarce resources make rivals of even the closest kin. When our ancestors met Neanderthals, the hunts may have overlapped, the shelters contested. Yet, it is also easy to imagine moments of alliance, a shared fire, a traded tool, a child born of two worlds. In such unions, humanity was not divided but expanded. enriched by the strength of cousins who would one day vanish. For vanish they did. The Neanderthals endured for tens of thousands of years after Toba, but slowly their numbers dwindled. By 40,000 years ago, they were gone. The Denisovans, too, faded into mystery, leaving only traces in our genes and bones in a Siberian cave. Why they disappeared remains uncertain. Perhaps the changing climate, perhaps competition with us, perhaps the narrowing of resources that began in those dark years after Toba. What is certain is that we are not pure. We are not only Homo sapiens. Within each of us are echoes of those other humans who walked beside us. The strength of Neanderthal bodies, the adaptations of Denisovan lungs for high altitudes, these linger in our blood, gifts of survival that carry forward even now. So the story of Toba is not only our story, it is the story of all humans in every form. It is the story of Neanderthals huddled against snow, of Denisovans carving tools in mountain caves, of sapiens wandering east with fire in hand. Together we face the darkness. Not all survived, but none were untouched. When we close our eyes and imagine that ancient world, we should remember that the night after Toba was filled with many kinds of voices. Different tongues, different bodies, but the same fear of hunger, the same awe of fire, the same longing for light. In the end, only one lineage would remain dominant, but within that lineage are the remnants of all the others. We carry them with us, whether we remember or not. The Neanderthals and Denisovans remind us that humanity has never been one story, but many woven together. Toba tested them all. And though most branches withered, their leaves still cling faintly to the tree we call ourselves. Disasters fade from memory, but the earth itself remembers. What humans could not write, the land recorded in silence, layer by layer, in stone, in ice, in ash. Long after the survivors of Toba were gone, their story lay hidden beneath the ground, waiting for hands and eyes curious enough to uncover it. When modern scientists began studying ancient soils and sediments, they discovered something extraordinary, a thin, distinct layer of ash spread across vast distances. From India to Malaysia, from the Arabian Peninsula to the South China Sea, the same gray fingerprint appears, buried deep in the earth. This was no local eruption, no small fire of the earth. It was a scar on a global scale. In India, archaeologists digging near the Narmada River found stone tools beneath and above the layer of ash. The tools beneath spoke of lives interrupted, the work of humans before the eruption. The tools above spoke of persistence, of survival in the aftermath. The ash in between was the silence of Toba, the boundary between two worlds, one before, one after. Elsewhere, cores drilled from the ocean floor revealed layers of volcanic glass, shards fine and sharp, carried by winds and rains into the sea. In Greenland's ice, trapped bubbles of air tell of changing climates, of sudden cooling that followed the eruption. The earth does not forget. Yet even as the evidence grows, so too does debate. Some scientists argue that the Toba eruption plunged humanity to the edge of extinction, collapsing our numbers into the genetic bottleneck. Others suggest its effects, while devastating, were less absolute, that some regions may have escaped the worst, that some groups may have continued with little interruption. But even within disagreement, the scale is undeniable. The ash found in India is meters thick, smothering ancient landscapes. In Malaysia, it blankets entire regions, evidence of a storm of fire that crossed continents. In Africa, climate records show drying and cooling at the same time, a rhythm that matches the eruption's shadow. To imagine this ash is to imagine time itself. Every flake that fell carried the memory of the eruption, settling into rivers, into valleys, into the fur of animals and the lungs of humans. It became part of the story of Earth. Buried for 70,000 years, it still waits, gray and fine, to remind us of the day when the sky turned black. Archaeologists kneel in silence before these layers. They sift with brushes, uncovering stone flakes, fragments of bone, charcoal from long-dead fires. Each piece whispers that humans were here, that even in the shadow of Toba, they endured. The tools are simple: flakes, scrapers, points, but they are also profound. They are proof that humanity did not end. And in the caves of Africa and Asia, handprints remain. Red ochre smeared against stone, the outline of palms pressed by people who lived through darkness. Were they painted before Toba or after? We cannot know. But to look upon them is to feel connection, a reminder that behind every layer of ash there were faces, hands, and voices determined not to vanish. The land remembers, and so do we. The story of Toba is written not in chronicles of kings, but in ash and stone, in tools left scattered, in the DNA within us. To walk upon the earth today is to tread upon its memory, upon the quiet testimony of a world that once nearly lost us. The eruption of Toba was not the last time the earth reminded us of its power. It was, however, one of the most profound. 70,000 years have passed, yet the lesson remains. Humanity is fragile, and the planet is restless. When we look back at Toba, we see more than an ancient disaster. We see a warning, the ash that spread across continents, the winter that silenced forests, the hunger that nearly ended us. All of it is a reminder that our species walks a narrow line between endurance and extinction. Even now, the Earth holds giants like Toba. In the heart of North America, beneath Yellowstone, lies another supervolcano. Its caldera, vast and hidden, is fed by reservoirs of magma that stir from time to time, shaking the ground and heating the springs. In Italy, the Campi Flegrei, near Naples, swells with quiet tension, its fields steaming with sulfur, its past marked by violent explosions. In South America, in New Zealand, in Indonesia still, the earth keeps its furnaces alive. Supervolcanoes are rare, but they do not sleep forever. Scientists who study them know that eruptions on the scale of Toba are measured not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. To us, that may seem like eternity. To the earth, it is no time at all. What would such an eruption mean today? Unlike our ancestors, we are billions, not thousands. Unlike them, we have cities, machines, satellites, and science. But in some ways, we are no less vulnerable. Ash can ground aircraft, collapse roofs, and poison water. A veil of sulfur high in the atmosphere could dim the sun again, lowering temperatures across the globe. Crops could fail, supply chains collapse, famine spread. Not in one valley, but across continents. Toba reminds us that human power is small compared to planetary force. Our tallest buildings, our strongest weapons, our deepest knowledge cannot quiet a mountain. We can measure, we can predict, we can prepare, but we cannot prevent. Yet, the lesson of Toba is not only one of fear, it is also one of resilience. Humanity then was weaker, smaller, less prepared than we are now, yet survival was possible. In caves, on coasts, along rivers, our ancestors endured. They carried fire, shared food, told stories, and lived through a winter that seemed endless. From their survival came us. So what do we carry forward? First, humility. That the earth is vast and alive, and that we are but one fragile species upon it. Second, vigilance that disasters will come again, though we do not know when or where. And third, memory that survival is possible, even in the darkest of nights. Scientists today work to map supervolcanoes, to understand their cycles, to plan for what might come. Emergency stores of food, strategies for preserving crops, systems for monitoring ash and air, all of these are part of the effort to avoid the fate that nearly consumed us. But, beyond science, there must also be unity. Just as our ancestors leaned on one another, so too must we. In the face of disaster, isolation is death, cooperation is survival. When we tell the story of Toba, it is not only a story of ash and fire. It is a story of us, of what it means to be human, fragile yet enduring, afraid yet unyielding. It is a reminder that catastrophe does not only destroy, it also shapes. From Toba's shadow, belief was born, migration began, resilience was forged. And so, the lesson of Toba is not only that the earth can erase us, but that we can endure even when erasure seems certain. To remember Toba is to remember the edge we walked, the night we survived, and the flame we carried through the dark. The giant in Sumatra still sleeps beneath Lake Toba. Yellowstone breathes beneath America. Campi Flegrei smolders beneath Italy. The earth has not forgotten its power, neither should we. The long winter of Toba did not last forever. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the veil of ash began to thin. Winds carried dust away. Rains washed rivers clear. And at last, after years of twilight, sunlight pierced the haze again. The world was wounded, but it was breathing once more. For humanity, survival had been reduced to a flicker, yet that flicker did not die. From the few thousand who endured, new life began to grow. Children were born into a world still scarred, but brighter than it had been. Forests sprouted green shoots through the gray. Animals returned in cautious herds. Rivers that had run muddy with ash ran clear again, their banks lined with reeds and fish. This was not a sudden rebirth, but a gradual, fragile renewal. Groups that had nearly starved found themselves with more food. Fires that had been guarded like treasure now burned more freely, fed by wood from forests that were recovering. Songs whispered in the dark grew stronger, louder, echoing in caves that had once known only fear. The survivors carried more than their bodies into this new world. They carried memory. They carried the scars of hunger, of despair, of journeys through ash and snow. And in those memories lay the seeds of change. To have lived through the shadow of Toba was to understand the fragility of life more deeply than ever. That understanding became part of what it meant to be human. In this rebirth, humans began to spread again, cautiously at first, then with greater confidence. The migrations that had begun in desperation continued in exploration. Groups moved farther, seeking richer lands, more stable climates, new horizons. What had started as flight became expansion. Humanity was no longer confined to a cradle. It was becoming a species of the world. Tools became more refined, stones were shaped with greater skill, bones carved into needles, spears tipped with sharper points. Fire was no longer only a shield against the dark, but a tool of creation, used to harden wood, to clear land, to cook in ways that expanded diets. The lessons learned in famine fueled innovation. Art began to stir as well. In caves, handprints and ochre lines multiplied, no longer just signs of presence, but expressions of thought. Perhaps these paintings were prayers of thanks for survival, or offerings to ensure that such darkness would never return. Perhaps they were simply affirmations of life, marks that said, "We are here, we endured." Communities grew tighter. Where once survival had demanded only cooperation, now it demanded memory. Stories were told and retold, carrying warnings of hunger, of fire, of the fragility of life. These stories bound people across generations, turning survival into tradition, tradition into culture. The ancestors who had lived through Toba became legends, their endurance honored in the whispers of their descendants. This rebirth was not without struggle. The earth remained harsh. Ice Age cycles continued, bringing cold and scarcity in waves. But compared to the long night of Toba, these challenges were survivable. Humanity had faced extinction and endured. The memory of that endurance made every hardship that followed less final, less absolute. In time, the descendants of the survivors filled new lands. They hunted mammoths on frozen plains, fished in tropical seas, carved shelters into mountains, and crossed deserts that once seemed impassable. Every step was a continuation of the story begun in the shadow of Toba, the story of a species that refused to vanish. And as humanity spread, so too did its resilience. The rebirth from ash was not just physical, but spiritual. The survivors had learned that life could be taken in an instant, that the earth itself could rise against them. But they had also learned that even against such odds, survival was possible. That lesson lived on, shaping the way humans faced every future challenge. The world after Toba was quieter, emptier, but also full of possibility. The fire that had once been fragile now burned brighter. The species that had once been reduced to a few thousand now began to grow again, slowly at first, then steadily, filling valleys, rivers, and plains. It is from this rebirth that the rest of our story begins. Civilizations, languages, art, and memory, all of it traces back to those who endured the darkness and stepped into the light. Without them, there would be no us. Without their survival, there would be no story to tell. From ash, we were reborn. From near silence, we rose into song. From the edge of extinction, we walked back into life. And though we may forget the details, though the memory of Toba lies buried in stone and DNA, its lesson is alive in us still. We are fragile, we are enduring, we are children of fire and ash, but also of rebirth and light. Every one of us alive today carries a silent inheritance. It is not in the objects passed down from parent to child, nor in the stories told at night. It lies deeper in the marrow of our bones, in the code that builds our bodies. It is the whisper of survival, spoken by ancestors who endured the shadow of Toba. Imagine them now, a mother holding her child close in a cave filled with smoke, a hunter walking miles across ash-choked plains, his stomach empty, his steps heavy, an elder sitting by a dwindling fire, telling stories so that children might forget their hunger for a little while. These were not kings or conquerors. They left no monuments of stone, no written names, yet they are the reason we are here. Geneticists tell us that every human being alive today may be descended from only a few thousand people who survived those years of famine and darkness. When you look into a mirror, you are looking at the reflection of their triumph. The shape of your face, the rhythm of your heartbeat, the timbre of your voice, each is a gift carried through the bottleneck of survival. But beyond the science, there is a deeper truth. We are not only flesh and bone, we are memory. We carry the unspoken legacy of fear and hope, of nights endured and mornings awaited. In every culture across the world, myths tell of floods, of fires, of worlds destroyed and worlds remade. Perhaps these myths are echoes of Toba, fragments of memory passed down as story. Perhaps in their voices, we still hear the ancestors whispering, remember, endure, live. At night, when the world falls silent, it is easy to imagine them near. Their fires flicker in the distance, their voices rise in songs no longer understood. Their eyes turn toward the same stars that we watch now. They are with us not as ghosts, but as roots. Every choice they made, to walk instead of stay, to share instead of hoard, to hope instead of surrender, shaped the branches that grew into us. And what would they say to us now? Perhaps they would not speak of science or history, but of the simple truths that carried them through. Keep the fire alive, stay together, tell the stories, do not give in to despair. For it was not only strong arms or sharp tools that saved them, but the will to remain human, even when the world itself seemed to demand otherwise. When you breathe, when your heart beats, when your eyes close at night, you are participating in a continuity that stretches back 70,000 years. The ancestors whisper through you, in your resilience, in your longing, in your endless search for meaning. They remind us that our story did not begin in palaces or cities, but in caves, in hunger, in darkness, and in survival against impossible odds. So let us honor them, not with monuments of stone, but with remembrance. Let us remember that our existence is not guaranteed, that every comfort we hold rests on the fragile thread they preserved. Let us remember that in the deepest night, when the world grew silent and cold, they carried the fire forward. And because of them, we are here to listen, to speak, and to dream. The whispers of the ancestors are quiet, but they are steady. They live in every cell, in every story, in every gaze cast at the stars. They tell us, you are the survivors. You are the children of endurance. Carry the fire, carry the story, carry us forward. The story of Toba is not only a story of fire and ash, it is a story of echoes, carried forward across 70,000 years, whispering still in our bodies and our minds. It is a story of fragility and of endurance, of how close we came to silence and how fiercely we clung to life. When the mountain tore itself apart, it did not know us. The earth does not rage or forgive. It simply moves, breathes, and burns as it has since long before our species existed. But in the shadow of that indifference, humanity proved itself. Small bands of frightened, hungry people found ways to endure, and from their endurance came everything we are. Every city skyline, every language spoken, every poem written, every hand raised in kindness. Each of these is possible only because a few thousand souls carried fire through the darkness. Without them, there would be no memory, no culture, no us. The echoes of their struggle live within us. In our DNA, we see the narrowing of our past, the bottleneck that shaped us. In our myths, we hear the faint memory of floods, of fire, of worlds destroyed and renewed. In our fears of darkness, of hunger, of silence, we feel what they felt. The past is never gone, it breathes with us still. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of remembering Toba. It humbles us, it reminds us that we are not masters of this planet, but children of it. It reminds us that our presence here is not guaranteed, that the comforts we take for granted rest upon survival, bought at a terrible price. But it also gives us hope. If humanity could endure Toba, if we could rise from ash and famine and darkness, then perhaps we can endure what is yet to come. Disasters will strike again, storms and quakes and eruptions that we cannot stop. Yet the fire of survival is in us still. We are not only fragile, we are resilient. We are not only vulnerable, we are enduring. So as you listen now, perhaps in the quiet before sleep, remember that you are part of a story older than kings and empires. You are part of a lineage that survived the darkest night. You carry the whispers of the ancestors, the scars of survival, and the strength of renewal. When you close your eyes, imagine their fires. Imagine the voices that rose in song against despair. Imagine the hands that reached for one another in the cold. And know that you are their echo, alive in a world they could not have imagined, carrying forward the flame they refused to let die. The night of Toba has long passed, the ash has settled, the skies have cleared, but the echoes remain in us, around us, reminding us that even at the edge of extinction, humanity chose life. And so let this story end as it began, with fire. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of survival, glowing softly against the dark. May its warmth remind you that you are never alone, that you are part of an unbroken chain stretching back through time. Sleep now with the whispers of the past in your heart and the promise of tomorrow in your breath.